from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, full throttle. Attacks in the Middle East continue at full intensity just a day after President Trump extended the diplomatic deadline. The president calling operations great on Truth Social, even as fears of a prolonged conflict rattle Wall Street. Yes, the losing streak continues. The Dow and Nasdaq entering correction territory today after another brutal session. The S&P 500 closing out its longest stretch of losses in 4 years. We'll look at where the damage is worst and where investors are still finding cover. And not a done deal. House Republicans reject the Senate's DHS funding plan today, setting up a standoff that risks a longer shutdown. Speaker Mike Johnson on the offense.
They have taken hostage the funding processes of government so that they can impose their radical agenda on the American people, and we can't have any part of it. This gambit that was done last night is a joke. I'm quite convinced that it can't be that every Senate Republican read the language of this bill.
We'll hear from members on both sides of the aisle this hour, but we begin tonight with the markets roiled by the ongoing war with Iran. Stocks tumbling today, the Nasdaq 100 and Dow Industrial Average both falling into correction territory. The S&P 500 on track now for the longest losing streak since 2022 as oil continues to climb into the triple digits. We get straight now to details in Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who joins us live from New York. Nora?
Well, Joe, a tough day and a tough week here on Wall Street. I'm taking a look at what's been happening here in the market. We saw spiking oil prices really threatening the idea of how people are thinking about the global economy as a whole. We see the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average both closing lower today by 1.7%. We saw the tech-heavy Nasdaq 100 down by about 1.9%. And taking a look at those small caps, the Russell 2000 lower by 1.8% on the day. But digging a bit deeper into the Nasdaq 100, this was an interesting aspect of the day. We saw the Nasdaq 100 falling into correction territory. So not a 20% bear market plunge, but still a 10% drop from that October peak. And this is the first time that we've seen this happen, Joe, since Trump's quote-unquote Liberation Day of April 2025. So really remarkable as we're seeing how this is really trickling out into the market. A lot of people really still concerned about heavy spending, the AI scare, really causing investors to flee any sort of risky or big tech assets. The Dow Jones Industrial Average also entering correction territory today. And the S&P 500 seeing its fifth straight week of losses. This is the longest weekly losing streak that we've seen since 2022. We saw consumer discretionary and financials being some of the worst performing groups in the S&P 500. And volatility, we really see, of course, the VIX in focus because this is Wall Street's fear gauge, breaking above that 30 handle, right now sitting at about 31. And we're, of course, still keeping our eye on oil because this has really been driving the story in recent weeks. We see Brent crude currently higher by about 6.3%. I've also got my eyes on West Texas Intermediate crude, currently higher by about 5.5%. So you're still continuing to see this really ricocheting through the market as we continue to see the impact and track all of the implications for the U.S. consumer. If you take a look at what's going on with consumer gas, we're currently seeing that right now also in focus. We know that consumer gas has surged by about 40% year to date. A lot of this driven by all of the fears in regards to the conflict in the Middle East. That really also, of course, weighing on diesel. So we are seeing prices just surging across the board. And taking a look lastly at what's going on in the Treasury market, because of course we need to look at the implications there as well. So we do see the 2-year Treasury yield currently at about 3.9%. I got the 10-year in focus, 4.4%, and the 20 and the 30-year at about 4.9% right now, Joe.
Tough stuff here. Nora, thank you. Bloomberg's Nora Melinda with the superlatives to help put today's moves in perspective. I'm glad we can add the voice of Bloomberg's Kristine Aquino, managing editor of Bloomberg's Markets Live blog. Kristine, thank you so much for being here. We're looking at a Nasdaq and a Dow in correction territory, an S&P 500 that's back below the 200-day. All these brutal headlines aside, technically speaking, what is this market telling us?
Well, Joe, I mean, today we did breach a very important technical support level in the S&P 500, and that's probably what opened the path for further declines here. I think what's worrying about this current setup beyond that technical breach is the fact that the broader market setup at the moment is conducive to further losses here. Positioning is not overly short at the moment. That means that investors have a lot more room room to offload whatever equity assets that they have in their portfolios at the moment. And then, of course, we're also seeing an increase in volatility, which usually comes in times like this when we're seeing a lot of investors being primed to sell. And really the question is, of course, how long this conflict is going to last. And that very much feeds as well into how long oil prices will stay elevated, Joe.
Well, and I'm curious, what's more of a concern for the investor right now? Is it oil prices, WTI near 100, Brent is at almost 115 here, or is it the interest rates that we saw bubbling up this week? The 10-year at 442, the 30 at almost 5%, Kristine.
Well, Joe, it is really two sides of the same coin. I mean, the immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction, of course, we're seeing is the high oil prices. That is very much doing a number on risk sentiment. As we can see, the correlation between the S&P 500 and WTI prices, of course, very much negative at the moment. We've really only seen that a few times over the last 5 years, and it is during times when high oil prices are kind of galvanizing inflation expectations. And then, of course, taking its toll on markets, because there is the expectation that higher prices, higher energy costs will limit consumers' ability to consume. And that is, in fact, the fear right now. And of course, how that feeds into treasury markets is a little bit of a different story. Again, as you mentioned, it really depends on the Federal Reserve's reaction function, right? At the moment, I think policymakers are kind of caught in between the ability to kind of respond to the inflationary impact of higher oil prices. A lot of policymakers have dismissed that as potentially transitory at the moment. But Joe, we've heard that one before, and that didn't exactly work out well for the Fed when that was the tune that they were singing around 2021, 2022.
Isn't that the truth? We can only see through so much here. We promised context at Bloomberg. Look no further than Kristine Aquino. Thank you so much, Kristine, for all of the information. And we turn to Capitol Hill now, where after a late night, or should I say early morning of voting, the Senate passed legislation to fund most of the Department of Homeland Security. It actually happened, creating a path to end the partial shutdown and restore order to the nation's airports. House Republicans see this very differently. Speaker Mike Johnson and Republican leadership now resisting calls for swift passage of that bipartisan Senate legislation, instead now promising to take up an 8-week funding measure, a continuing resolution for all of DHS. That would include ICE. Here's Speaker Johnson laying out the House Republican proposal a short time ago.
We will reduce the lines and the waits at the airlines, and we'll make sure that those who are protecting us are paid. But what we are going to present and what we're going to vote on this floor, our Rules Committee is working through this right now. We're going to put a clean, simple, continuing resolution that will go until May 22nd. It's just a number of weeks to allow for all those who sacrificially serve the country and protect other Americans, all these agencies, 10 agencies under the Department of Homeland Security, will continue at their current funding levels to make sure that they are protected.
That is the most recent commentary from the Speaker. And joining us now live from Capitol Hill is Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska. Back with us on Bloomberg, chair of the Republican Main Street Caucus, serves as well on the House Financial Services Committee. It's great to see you, Congressman. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Just to pick up on what the Speaker said there, are you in for a late night? Do you actually expect a vote on the floor this evening?
I do. I think the first vote will be simply to adjourn for the day and then come back in and have a Rules Committee product to take up, and hopefully a self-executing rule that will allow us to fund the government from the House perspective through May 22nd. That puts us kind of right before Memorial Day in terms of our legislative calendar. So I think that could happen tonight around maybe 10:30. It could go into the middle of the night. But what the Senate sent over, and I had to be convinced of this, did not have any funding in it for ICE or Border Patrol. Listen, we had an election on this. President Trump won. People want the border secured. And when we saw that, and then I verified it, it's right there in Section 4, and we just can't vote for that.
Well, that was the whole point of the deal, right, is that since ICE has money for the next several years through the big, beautiful bill, this would get things back open. And then the talk was to have ICE funding then brought forth in a reconciliation package. Is that whole scenario off the table now?
Well, I think we should be able to do this with 60 votes in the Senate at some point. Listen, the One Big Beautiful Bill did have money for ongoing operations, but not staff money. It had money for building the wall, technology, actual securing of the border for the Border Patrol, but it didn't have any money in there to pay Border Patrol agents or any money in there to pay ICE agents. When we got the Senate bill in Section 4, it basically took those two sub-agencies down to $0. And then I looked and compared it to the House version. We affirmatively fund those two agencies. There's $0 in there. And I don't think Americans want to go to bed tonight knowing that the Border Patrol agents and all the folks that are working without a paycheck aren't watching the border.
Well, it's interesting because until now we had kept hearing that ICE was fully funded through, I believe, 2028 or 29. That was clearly not the case in your view.
Well, we spent literally an hour and 45 minutes on with the speaker, and then we had a Main Street caucus with another 55 members. We got a hold of appropriation staff. We got a hold of Homeland Security Committee staff. We drilled down into that issue, and in fact, that money doesn't go towards staffing. It can be used in other ways, but it will not keep the Border Patrol open.
Okay. Congressman, we heard from the president just a couple of moments ago. He's on his way to Miami, where he's going to be speaking a short time from now at an investment conference that's happening there. He was asked about this break between the Senate and the House, and I'd love for you to listen to what he said. We'll have you respond.
I understand John Thune and I understand Mike Johnson. They want to be sure that people aren't coming into our country like they have for the last 4 years. I don't want to say they've ruined it. They made my job a lot harder.
So I guess the split here in Congress is giving the president some agita. Has he weighed in on this with the Speaker of the House? I know that he's had a couple of interviews, but he never fully endorsed that Senate plan. Will the president make the final call on this?
Well, of the three branches of government today, the executive branch gets the gold star because he signed an executive order that allows them to use some discretionary money to pay TSA agents. And I think that's really what's driven this pressure point, and that should eliminate those lines, get our air traffic moving again. You should not stand in a line for 6 hours in Houston. That's Washington totally abdicating its responsibility. So, first of all, the president did all of us a favor by signing that today. I think what you're intimating there is correct. I saw on another network that he said that he wasn't in support of what the Senate did. He's managing relationships between his friend John Thune and his friend Mike Johnson. Listen, what they did was at 3 in the morning. They did it with unanimous consent. For as deliberative of a body as they are, it surprised me. And then when we got to work this morning, somebody said, oh, they sent the funding down to $0 for ICE and CBP. I had to look at it, and I had to read that. And I went to Section 4. I compared it to our bill. I looked at the tables, and they're absolutely right. That is going backwards. That is going backwards in America. As long as the TSA agents are working, and they are on a temporary executive order, and we are going to do this thoughtfully by extending the funding until May 22nd, cooler heads will prevail. We will get through this, and this will be nothing more than a hiccup.
I'd love to ask you about Iran, but just quickly, if you pass this bill tonight, tomorrow, do you actually expect the Senate to come back to town to vote on it?
Well, they're going to have the opportunity to get some feedback over the weekend. You know, I think a lot of Americans woke up this morning, and I was, to be quite frank, I was excited at the idea that the Senate accomplished this. But the idea of not funding those two agencies, I think, doesn't sit well with a lot of Americans. And so I'm hopeful that people will reach out, they'll share their thoughts and their approach to this, and the senators will have the opportunity to use their procedure called unanimous consent on Monday and adopt what we did. Now, I don't think that'll happen. I think those Senate Democrats are pretty bought in. But the good news, again, the gold star branch of government today, the executive branch, the TSA lines, I think, were contributing to a lot of the pressure here. That will be taken off the table. We'll get those folks paid. And then we have to do this the right way and fund DHS appropriately so that we're acting in the best interest of the American people.
Just lastly, Congressman, we're looking at a national average for gasoline. Actually went down a tick today, $3.97. I realize you're not paying that in Nebraska. It's $3.36 a gallon. The president just added another 10 days to the clock here on the potential for diplomacy with Iran. Are you comfortable with the trajectory of this war?
Listen, these Iranians have had us in their crosshairs for 49 years. They are the sole and largest sponsor of terror around the world. We're doing what has to be done to rid ourselves of this perennial problem. Yes, higher gas prices are not appreciated nor in any way enjoyed. However, gas prices came crashing down last year in President Trump's first year of his second term. I'm confident that this will be temporary. We'll get the oil moving again. We'll work with other nations to do it. You know, I talked to folks that represent the Kurds yesterday in Iraq, and they're like, thank you, President Trump, for standing up and dealing with something that has been ignored more or less by a lot of American leaders for the better part of 4 decades. Now we've got some action. We've got some progress. We're making progress. This had to be done. It's getting done, and we need to rid Iran of any nuclear material. Unless they want to make electricity, we can certainly find a way to make that happen. But a bomb with our name on it? No, that's not happening.
He's the chairman of the Republican Main Street Caucus, Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska. It's good to see you, sir. Thank you for being with us. And we'll keep tabs on the voting this evening, of course. Also, coming up, we will hear from a member from across the aisle. Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois will join us on his party's position on the DHS stopgap measure making its way through the House as we speak this evening. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
When we started out, we had the great work that were done in appropriations on both the House and Senate side. We had a bipartisan, bicameral bill to actually get our 12th appropriation bill through. And then the Democrats completely blew this up in the Senate. And we've been, 42 days now that DHS has been unfunded. And it's clear that they put politics above public safety.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Spoke earlier today with Republican Congressman Troy Downing there of Montana, accusing congressional Democrats of putting politics over the safety of the country. Well, you heard what he said, of course, and we're waiting for an important vote as early as this evening on a stopgap solution that would supersede the Senate that last evening passed a bill to fund DHS with the exception of ICE funding. This is, of course, what Democrats and Republicans have been working on for days. It's where we start our conversation with Congressman Sean Casten, the Democrat from Illinois, is with us right now to get into this. Congressman, it's great to have you with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. I know you're joining us from your perch on the House Financial Services Committee with some sensitivity to the economy, and we'd like to get into the matter involving Iran as well. But we understand there could be a vote on a stopgap this evening, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Are you planning to vote yes and supersede the bipartisan bill that passed the Senate?
So I'm not planning on voting yes, but understand, I mean, this is one of these days that, like, you have to be a Washington insider to realize how stupid this is. We woke up this morning with the Senate having passed a bill, and we could have voted quickly and gone home with everything funded. We are instead going to stay here late at night and not fund anything on the DHS side. That is a choice that is entirely at Speaker Johnson's discretion, because when the Senate passed that bill, we had everything funded. We had the President of the United States saying, I have the authority to repurpose $10 billion of funds from the BBB that can keep TSA going. All of that was teed up for this morning. And then the Freedom Caucus went crazy. Mike Johnson didn't want to alienate the Freedom Caucus. So we're now bringing a bill forward that would provide unconstrained funding for ICE, for CBP, ignore all the things that we know cannot pass the Senate, because we just tested that in the Senate, and send this out where the senators aren't here so they don't pass it. So now we're going to leave those things all unfunded purely because Mike Johnson didn't want to alienate the Freedom Caucus. That's not the way government should run, but it's the way that Mike Johnson's running the House right now.
So this shutdown's going to last a while longer, right? Everybody's leaving for a 2-week recess. President's paid TSA agents. What's the motivation to make a deal?
Well, look, I think it's important to view this outside of a political lens if we can. ICE murdered Americans in the street. They're wearing masks. This is the top issue that we're hearing at home. And it doesn't seem too much to ask to say if we are going to provide funding for an agency, which, by the way, is currently sitting on 3 times their annual funding because of the BBB. So they've already got all their money. The fact that we can't go in and say, put some accountability so that these people behave the way that we expect law enforcement officers to behave, this is not politics. This is, do I want to go home and look my constituents in the eye and say, somebody died today because of something I could have prevented? And that's ultimately why I'm a no on this package. But again, we had a way to solve that 4 hours ago.
Well, we just talked to Congressman Mike Flood. Republican, Nebraska, chairs the Republican Main Street Caucus. He told us that after careful reading of the bill, that in fact the big beautiful bill does not fund ICE to the extent that people have been saying, that it doesn't pay for staffing, for instance, and therefore that Senate bill was completely unacceptable. Do you know what he's talking about there?
I have no idea what he's talking about. It is factually the case that, look, it's hard to argue that ICE doesn't have money for staffing or that they have less money than they need when apparently the president can send them off to wander around airports and beat people up in circumstances that they have no authority over. Apparently those people were funded, were paid, were out there and not needed in other circumstances. So I think this is one of these things where you have to disbelieve your own eyes to believe some of the words that are coming out. And look, Congressman Flood's a friend. I don't mean to disparage him, but it is simply not true that you throw $75 billion at an agency and somehow they don't have enough for staffing, which is what the big ugly bill did.
You know, I understand there's yelling in the Rules Committee right now, Congressman. I don't know if you're hearing about what they're yelling about. Is there a chance this bill, this CR, does not get to the floor the next couple days?
I think we're all watching the Rules Committee and, not volitionally, but we're watching to see what happens. My expectation is that somehow they probably do send something to the floor tonight. I don't know whether it passes on the floor tonight, but if it does, we will then have a bill that the Senate is under no urgency to take up, and that doesn't have 60 votes in the Senate because the senators, it has to get to 60. We may not like, the Republicans may not like, it has to be bipartisan, but it has to be bipartisan. We know what the terms are of a bipartisan agreement in the Senate. So kicking something back that they just opposed, all that does, that is a conscious choice to say that for the next 2-3 weeks, we are not going to pay our TSA agents. We're not going to provide money for FEMA. We're not going to provide money for the Coast Guard. That is a choice. It's not a choice that we should have made. It's not the choice the Senate made last night on a unanimous basis, but it is the choice that's being made by the package of floors that are coming to the floor potentially this evening.
Can I just ask you, we've got about a minute left, Congressman, from your perspective on House Financial Joint Economic Committees, how exactly will these agents get paid by the president's executive order? Is that money that will move automatically without Congress being involved?
Well, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because I had some concerns when that order came out. As a matter of law, the president cannot take money from an account that's been earmarked by the Congress for one purpose and use it for another purpose. In this case, there was a $10 billion slush fund within the big ugly bill that the president has pretty broad discretion over. So the president does have authority with respect to that specific $10 billion bucket to reposition some funds. And so that's not unconstitutional as an authority. Now, I would point out that the president had that authority 2 weeks ago. The president had that authority a month ago. So all those TSA officers who weren't getting paid, essentially that is the choice of the president to have waited that long. I'm glad he's finally using that authority, but that didn't have to happen legally.
Well, it is strange, too, that we talk about the poor TSA agents, and I wouldn't want to be dealing with what they are. But FEMA, Coast Guard, I guess that'll be for another conversation. Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois with us live from Capitol Hill, Congressman. It's always good to spend some time, and we appreciate it. Coming up, the U.S. and Israel exchanging missile fire with Iran despite the extended deadline. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, which is gripped, of course, in a DHS stalemate, and we'll keep tabs on that for you this evening. Thousands, meantime, have converged on Dallas, Texas to attend CPAC, the biggest annual political conference for American conservatives. Conference typically underscores support, at least these days, for President Trump and his policies. This year, it's exposing some splintering views within the MAGA coalition over the war in Iran as the conflict nears its fifth week now. Joining us with details on what's happening in Dallas. Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, who's been covering the event and just got back to town. Jeff, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining. It's been suggested that this CPAC feels a little bit different this year. You can tell us, you saw it firsthand.
I can, and it's good to be back. Thank you, Joe. A couple of things. One way that it's different is the president's not going, and he usually does. So that I think is a loss for the faithful there. And I don't think this is related to Iran, but there is definitely an overhang of question marks about his war. And that does not mean that the people who are there in Dallas right now gathering at CPAC are all upset with Trump, but there are certainly some who are questioning his decision to go into war with Iran after having promised as a presidential candidate that they would not do that. And my colleague and I, who worked on the story that you just showed, both heard from people who said they're concerned about the electoral ramifications of that coming up in November. And that's something we've talked about on your program a bunch of times. There's a lot of political risk for President Trump from this war, and some of that is with his base. All of that said, I want to emphasize as well that polling shows Republicans writ large absolutely still support this war. And I probably spoke to 20 people at CPAC, and the vast majority of those folks, and when I say people, I mean people on the ground, the vast majority of them were supportive both of the president and of the war in Iran.
Well, that's really important, Jeff, and I'm glad you said that. The last time I asked somebody on the program about a potential split in MAGA over geopolitics, I ended up on the Jon Stewart show because there are, of course, different narratives, but the bulk of MAGA is behind the president, apparently. I just wonder if we're seeing an evolving demographic at this event. CPAC's been going on for a long time. Matt Schlapp, the man behind it, actually might have gotten a sense of some different views in the room today. Here's a taste.
How many of you would like to see impeachment hearings? No. That was the wrong answer. Let me try it again. How many of you would like to see impeachment hearings? No.
Jeff, what does it mean when you have to ask that question twice?
Don't think that went the way that Matt expected it to go or intended it to go. I mean, my guess is that was just a simple misunderstanding by actually a pretty significant number of people in that crowd. I don't think that represents what most CPACers want to see. I think they just didn't get the question. Although it was a pretty straightforward question, so it's hard to explain that. But certainly my reporting and my experience at CPAC this week, again, would suggest that the vast majority of people there are big fans of the president. But I do think it's worth pointing out that loyalty, there is a risk to that loyalty based on how long this war goes, based on how high gasoline prices go. And they have had to suspend some, belief or general acceptance of promises that he made, both as a candidate and since coming into office. But that, let's be honest, Joe, is a part of the strength for President Trump of his base, is that he can do or say almost anything, and he has said as much, and in most cases continue to have their support, with a couple exceptions, one of which is the Jeffrey Epstein files, and one of which may be Iran. But so far, the divide on Iran, though it is there, it is not enormous.
Perfect analysis from Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, just back from CPAC in Texas. I always remember the book fair being the highlight of CPAC every year, Jeff. Thank you for sharing some of it with us here on Bloomberg. Coming up on Balance of Power, the war with Iran remains a critical issue for global leaders. And following a meeting of G7 foreign ministers in France, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, just back, provided this update today on whether or not he sees the need for ground troops in Iran. Listen to what he said.
We're going to destroy their factories that make missiles and rockets and drones. We're going to destroy their Navy. We're going to destroy their Air Force. And we are going to significantly destroy their missile launchers so they can never hide behind these things to get a nuclear weapon. We are achieving all those objectives. We are ahead of schedule on most of them. And we can achieve them without any ground troops.
Ahead of schedule, without ground troops. Joining us now with more, Holly Dagres, senior fellow in the Washington Institute's Viterbi program on Iran and U.S. policy, author of the Substack, The Iranist. Holly, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. To the extent that you have been following this, and I know that you're steeped in this, have you seen any consistent proof that actual negotiations are underway?
Well, Joe, first, thank you for having me on the program. I think there were initial reports that suggested that U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were in Pakistan, but it turns out that Witkoff was at a conference in Florida. And so we know that there's a trifecta of countries in the region, Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey, that have been pushing for a diplomatic solution. But the 15-point plan that reportedly the United States had put out had initially been rejected by the Iranians, at least per state media. And now we're hearing that Iranian officials are actually looking into it and trying to see what maybe there would be a middle ground. But at this moment, there's not any face-to-face or indirect talks happening just yet.
Well, interesting. The president says J.D. Vance, vice president, will help to lead these negotiations once they reach a formal and direct point. I just wonder, broadly speaking here, you've obviously had several weeks to think about this. Is there a path out of this war, diplomatically speaking, in which the IRGC remains in power and the people of Iran gain more rights and a better life?
It's hard to imagine that, because I think we've seen 47 years of what they're capable of. And we had this unprecedented massacre in January in response to yet another cyclical anti-regime protest of thousands, if not tens of thousands of Iranians that were killed. And that was why military assets were moved to the region to begin with. And so I think if the Islamic Republic wanted to course correct, they would have, in having heard so much anger from their people for years. And so I just can't imagine they would do a complete 180, because it wouldn't be the Islamic Republic then.
President Trump speaking in Miami, Holly, and I haven't heard this exact line yet, that Iran conducted nuclear blackmail for years and years, as we constantly hear, 47 years. Of course, it wasn't quite that long with nuclear technology. But what do you make of that framing of the Iranian regime?
I'm not entirely sure what he's in reference to, because we had a multilateral deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, or popularly known as the Iran nuclear deal. And so the president withdrew from that deal in 2018 without really having something to replace it. And arguably, we're in this moment, in this war, because we've never actually gone back to a deal and had a diplomatic solution that would curb Iran's enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. And so I'm not entirely sure what he's in reference to. Perhaps this notion that they might have been hiding the 400 kilograms of enriched uranium that we don't know where it's at, or the fact that there were some particles found at undeclared sites years ago.
How varied, to the extent that you can speak to this, how varied are the opinions of Iranians when it comes to this war?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize we're in an internet shutdown that started tomorrow will be 1 month. And it's really hard to get information out of the country. What we're getting is from landlines and from Starlink terminals. There's about 50 to 60,000 users. And I think there's really, it's harder to obviously measure these things harder than before. But I think there's a couple of trends that are really standing out. There's a mix of hope and fear. Hope that this will lead to a positive outcome where the regime is no longer in power and a democratic transition happens. Fear because this is a war and there are civilian casualties. There's about 1,500 civilian casualties since the war began, according to the group Human Rights Activists in Iran. But also fear that what happens if this regime survives. And I think there's a real worry about what the Islamic Republic will do to its people. And we saw that happen with the unprecedented massacre in January. So I think those are really the two trend lines you're seeing at this juncture.
Why would the Ayatollah cut a deal? And what would compel him to cut a deal after losing his family and being badly wounded in the initial strikes? Or is that not who the deal would be with? Would it be with secular leadership, Holly?
I think that's a question people are scratching their head and asking themselves. I know the president has hoped to get a Venezuela-like deal or scenario out of this. Yeah. He's been looking for a Delcy Rodriguez figure. But the truth is the Islamic Republic won't back down. It won't give up its ballistic missiles program. It won't give up its nuclear program. So it's hard for me to imagine, especially as you noted, that the current supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, would give in to those demands, because that would be seen as giving into the quote unquote great Satan, or the United States and Israel. And so I just can't see this regime making a deal like that, because then it would go against everything the Islamic Republic stands for. And the war has, in essence, created a scenario where there's more hardline figures taking the place of former officials that were killed. So I just can't imagine. I'd say that they would rather the Islamic Republic, or the country as a whole, burn than give in to those sort of demands, at least at this juncture.
Wow. We haven't mentioned Israel yet. Is it possible to actually have a deal between the U.S. and Iran without Israel signing on?
I don't think so. And I think that this is where the conversations between the United States and Israel arguably diverge. I think that President Trump was okay with regime change, and that is a change of leadership at the top. But I think that the Israelis would like to see regime collapse. They don't want to deal with this regime anymore. I think there's a recognition that that they will continue to rebuild ballistic missiles, to enrich uranium. And I'd argue that the president has been pushing for a Venezuela scenario, but I think in this moment he's created a North Korea, a regime that's more hardline, repressive. Wow. And if it had its druthers and was able to, it would develop a nuclear weapon just so it could prevent another conflict in the near future.
Well, that's an important view, Holly. With that said, what about the rest of the neighborhood? Iran got a missile through, at least one, to a Saudi airbase today, hit a couple of tankers on the ground, and some U.S. service members were injured. How likely is it that Saudi Arabia or others enter this conflict?
I don't think that they would enter it directly. I think there's a recognition that this is something the United States and Israel would lead, but I imagine they're scratching their head and thinking twice about where this war goes, because if this regime does survive, this is a neighbor that's going to be a lot more aggressive, a neighbor that is able to close the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that they're trying to understand that this is a regime that may not be worth talking to in the way they have in the past, especially for Saudi Arabia. I imagine they feel slighted after the Oman/China brokered deal in 2023 that helped Iran and Saudi Arabia recommence ties. And so I imagine that they're thinking twice about that. I know that they haven't called on the Iranian ambassador to be persona non grata, but I imagine that they're going to start thinking twice, as we've seen in the case of Lebanon and Qatar.
Holly Dagres, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute. Thanks again for joining, Holly, and sharing your insights. Coming up on Balance of Power, President Trump takes the stage Miami Beach at a conference that's showcasing the power and wealth of Saudi Arabia. There's a live view for those of you watching on Bloomberg TV. We'll bring you details, plus the 165-year-old tradition ended by the Treasury Department. We'll have that and more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. In tonight's Power Brief, Democratic Congresswoman Sheila Shifrillis McCormick from Florida faces potential expulsion from Congress after being found guilty of House ethics violations in a fiery trial last night. The representative was found guilty of 25 ethics charges following a 3-year investigation into allegations that she stole millions in federal relief funds and diverted them to her congressional campaign. In November, the Justice Department indicted the Congresswoman, alleging that she stole and laundered $5 million in FEMA funds. Shifrillis McCormick has denied any wrongdoing and pleaded not guilty to the federal charges. President Trump's name will soon be appearing on your money. In a first for a sitting U.S. president, his signature will be printed on paper currency to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States, according to the Treasury Department. Until now, U.S. currency had the signatures of the Treasury Secretary and the Treasurer. The president has sought to put his stamp on the country's 250th celebrations this year in a number of ways, including minting a dollar coin that features the president's image. Joining us now, our political panel. Let's get them together. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, our Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. I guess I'm supposed to ask you guys about this. Jeannie, can you picture a wallet full of Donald Trump money? Does that make it worth more somehow?
Yeah, this one is hard to believe. I hope every American has pockets full of money with or without Donald Trump's name on it. But with Donald Trump as president, that is becoming a harder thing to imagine.
Well, geez, but the Department of Homeland Security could use some of those dollars. They might even take some without Donald Trump's name on it. Rick, what has happened in the last 12 to 24 hours? Senators stayed up all night, passed a bill at 2:30. If you've been watching, you know the deal. This is the bill that would pay for DHS with the exception of ICE. This was supposed to be the path to freedom, and it got to the House and crashed into a wall.
Yeah, this is a rare event where you put a complete halt to the momentum to reopen an agency that's been closed for over 40 days. Yeah. I mean, it's really quite outrageous. Bipartisan, unanimous consent. Basically, the message is everyone in the United States Senate supports this bill, and it will get everybody paid right away. It hits the floor of the House. And what looked like an early morning euphoria, like finally we can go home. All they had to do is take it up and pass it. They could have been on an airplane by lunchtime.
Yes.
But they have a rebellion on the part of the Freedom Caucus, and that messed the whole deal up. And now they're fighting over rules so that they can vote on a bill that is dead on arrival in the Senate.
Okay.
And so, there's, in my humble opinion, zero chance that the Senate's going to break their Easter holiday and come back. Many of them are already on planes headed overseas.
Incredible.
And they're not going to come back and take that bill up just to actually vote it down.
So, Jeannie, does this now become officially the Republican shutdown? They've been accusing Democrats of holding DHS hostage, but Republicans were the last ones to touch the ball here, right?
Yeah, it's like Charlie Brown's football. Yeah, it is their shutdown, and it has been their shutdown. Democrats have been saying for weeks, let's get these TSA agents, let's get the Coast Guard, let's get them paid. ICE has money from the big, beautiful bill, so let's move this forward. And John Thune earlier this week proposed that to the president. The president rejected it. And we talked earlier today, Joe, and I said this is all up to Donald Trump, and you heard from Mike Johnson. It truly is. This is not just conservatives in the House. This is Donald Trump. He is pushing against this. He has been for some time, because if he wanted it, it would be done. And I think one thing to watch for, they've been hanging this on the lack of funding for ICE and CPB, but also watch for them to try to add the SAVE Act in there. That is, in my mind, what this is all about. They want to push the SAVE Act. Donald Trump said he wouldn't do anything with legislation until that's passed. And that's where I think this is going to be headed. Not that I think they have much chance on reconciliation, and they know that. So they're going to try to do it another way.
Well, let's hear from Mike Johnson. He spoke to reporters a short time after coming out of a caucus meeting. Here's what he said.
They have taken hostage the funding processes of government so that they can impose their radical agenda on the American people, and we can't have any part of it. This gambit that was done last night is a joke. I'm quite convinced that it can't be that every Senate Republican read the language of this bill.
This gambit is a joke, he said, and it's interesting. Mike Flood was on us with us earlier. He said he had to be convinced, but then read that ICE wasn't in fact funded to the extent that we thought in the big, beautiful bill, that money can't be used for staffing, so they had to take this action on a CR. Does that ring true to you?
Well, if that were true, ICE would not have been funded for the last 41 days.
Isn't that right?
And just like the TSA, we'd be all screaming about how can you not have ICE funded? And so that obviously has not been the case. They've been receiving checks. So there's some money in there that are paying them. And now, looks like Trump always had the option of using this slush fund that he got in the big, beautiful bill to fund all of this. So we actually could have had a scenario where no TSA agent was ever going to miss a paycheck, because now coming to the rescue after the bills have collapsed, and clearly the administration realizes that this initiative by the House is dead on arrival, because otherwise they wouldn't be reprogramming these funds to pay the TSA on Monday. And if that was true that ICE didn't have the money, they'd be paying the ICE agents on Monday, too. And no talk about doing that.
Well, this is a head scratcher, Jeannie. By the way, I guess if you work for FEMA or the Coast Guard, you're on your own. How come TSA gets all the attention when it comes to paychecks?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And if Donald Trump could have done this, why didn't he do it when they stopped the paychecks to begin with? And I think it's...
Well, could he pay FEMA as well and Coast Guard members?
Presumably, if this is even allowed, he could, if it's even legal. But I think it's important to just go back and remember what this is all about. This is because Republicans do not want to ensure that ICE is following the same regulations as every other police force in this country, as it pertains to judicial warrants, as it pertains to body cams, as it pertains to masks. That after 2 Americans were killed and many others wounded at the hands of these 2 organizations. That's what this is about. That's what Democrats were asking for. Let's bring this agency under control and let's focus on the economy. This is the extent to which Republicans in Congress and the president have gone to avoid doing something that the vast majority of Americans think makes sense. You don't treat people on the streets of our cities and towns in the way they have, and we have 2 dead Americans.
Guys, we have less than 2 minutes, and there's exclusive reporting by the Wall Street Journal now that U.S. service members have been injured in a strike, an Iranian strike on a Saudi airbase. This just happened a short time ago, hit a couple of U.S. tankers. The attack also involved drones, we're reading. Rick, did the president make the right move by adding 10 days to the clock?
Well, that was all about reopening the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes.
And it's not clear that we ever really had the intention, now that we've given 3 options, extensions to the threat, that we were going to bomb their infrastructure. Yeah. Doesn't mean we're not bombing other things.
That's right.
In Iran. And so this war is being prosecuted as if there's no agreements on anything. And anybody who thinks otherwise should look at what happened today in Saudi Arabia, where some of our service members were injured.
Just about 30 seconds, Jeannie. How much more critical does this make the timeline here for Donald Trump?
It's devastating. I mean, our hearts go out to the family, the friends, the injured soldiers. We are losing people, and the timeline matters. The president has got to de-escalate this, and he's got to do it now. It was a mistake to begin with. We should not be there, and the Senate should not have gone home for recess without voting to say that they need a resolution on the war.
This could be an important weekend as we keep our eyes on the Middle East. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you both so much for the insights. Make sure to stay here for a brand new Wall Street Week with Bloomberg's David Weston coming up next on Bloomberg TV and radio.